the pit that is World War I. Right? We're going to be dealing with the causes of World War I, the courses of World War I. There's going to be a lot of military histories, there's going to be some social history, and there's going to be a few of these battles that we're going to get to detail out. Not all of them with this. There's going to be some political shifts. Basically, this is World War I, and we're going to discuss this in as much detail as time will allow. Right? World War I, 1914 through 1918, is really going to deal the death blow to a lot of these empires around the world, and is going to fatally weaken, for the most part, the rest of them. It's definitely going to begin the slide. It's going to weaken the stranglehold of empire around the world. It's nothing new. This has been building for decades. World War I doesn't just sort of happen by accident. It is something that a lot of people have been talking about. There's going to be a big war. What's going to happen once it starts? There are four main long-term causes for World War I. The first of these is going to be nationalism, especially hyper-nationalism. But this idea of national competition that these countries had, we want to go against each other, we want to show how strong we are, had been building up from the idea of simple national identification, that we're us and you're you, okay? You fast forward about 100 years, and then you're going to get to this point, well, you know, we're awesome and you're terrible and we can't stand you and we want to separate ourselves, and eventually this is going to lead to the idea that nations should compete with one another, and we're going to see in World War I they're going to compete in a really unhealthy kind of way. The second one of these is militarism, and industrialization has led to a rapid increase in military size, really on size on all sides. Everybody is able to now field much larger armies with much greater technology than they had before. Industrialization had created these huge economies. These huge economies had created this huge militaries. Huge militaries were, at least in part, due to hyper-nationalism. You want to see a big military, so these two are definitely related to each other as well. Imperialism also factors into this, and that is many of these countries want to strive to gain colonial power around the world. This is especially true of Germany, while many countries are really reticent and they're very hesitant of Germany's imperial ambitions because they're afraid they're going to want to take some of theirs. And so Britain especially is going to fight to try to maintain its colonial possessions around the world. And last but not least, you're going to have the political failures of the secret alliance system, where these countries had developed these alliances with each other, but they did not discuss what they were going to do openly. It was sort of, it's actually not unlike what you'll see with a junior high romance, with, you go talk to so-and-so and you tell me what they say, and then, should you hear what they said? And it's not a very good idea to do when you're talking about millions of people losing their lives, because it's a very imprecise, uninformed way of doing business. One of the old diplomatic adages is it's better to have a bad policy that everybody knows about than a good one that nobody knows about, because countries will make miscalculations based on what do they think that you're going to do? What does this person think you're going to do? And so it's a really bad system all around. All of these deaths are going to start with one guy getting himself killed, and that's going to be Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He is the heir to the Habsburg throne. He was visiting Bosnia in one of these Serbian nationalists comes into, with actually a group of these guys, Gavrilo Princip and his group of terrorists of the Black Hand, right? Not a bad terrorist nickname, right? They come in and they shoot the guy. They were worried because Austria-Hungary was oppressing the Serbian ethnic group. They didn't want to see the Austro-Hungarians move into this place. And so they come in and they lay an ambush for Franz Ferdinand, who's giving a speech here in Bosnia, and they blow him away. They shoot him, they shoot his wife, and so there you go, right? Now, Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg monarchy, is understandably upset because their heir to the throne has been assassinated. And you would think, well, this seems like a pretty open and shut kind of case, right? These guys from Serbia's tiny, right? And the Austro-Hungarian Empire is very upset, so they just go in and they say, hey, give us this whole Black Hand organization, let us come in and take them apart. If Serbia says no, which they do, then you just go and you just crush Serbia. Right? You just go and you just beat the stuffing out of those people. And it doesn't seem like it should be that big of a deal. But Austria-Hungary doesn't want to get involved in a great big war because they understand that the Serbs are Slavs, the Russians are Slavs, the Russians are very concerned about what Austria-Hungary is doing in Eastern Europe near its border, and so this is a point of great concern. So what happens here is Austria-Hungary, instead of just sort of plowing under Serbia, which I think probably, based on the diplomatic correspondences that existed at the time, Russia probably would have been okay with, hey, you Serbs, you had it coming. But what happens is when they drag their feet and they begin gathering allies to kind of cover them in case, they get into trouble, it begins to take on the look that this is an overall kind of big kind of movement in Europe, and that then begins to start pulling in these other secret allies or semi-secret allies with this. Eventually, in this, in some cases, childish interplay of communications between these various governments, Germany is going to give carte blanche, going to give the go-ahead, blank check to Austria. You go and you deal with these guys, and we will back you up no matter what. What you're going to have is a rather silly, if it wasn't so sad, kind of series of events that takes place. Austria is going to declare war on Serbia. Russia is going to declare a war on Austria, but it's going to mobilize its entire frontier. That's going to cause Germany, which also shares a frontier with Russia, and as Austria's ally, is going to declare war on Russia and then attack France. You've got to back up a little bit in order to understand this part of the equation, because see, Germany borders both France and Russia, and their nightmare scenario is being invaded from two sides at the same time, where they have to split up their military. Some of it goes one way, some of it goes the other way. They want to stay together, they want to remain united. Well, they're not going to be able to do that in that kind of scenario, and they knew that Russia and France were tentative allies. They had signed an agreement to be allies. France, of course, is dragging its feet in this regard, and so Germany's kind of, well, the plan that they had come up with was to basically send everybody against France, knock them out very quickly, and then get everybody on trains and send them back against Russia before the Russians could do anything about it. So they're waiting, and France isn't declaring war, and blah, blah, blah. So finally, the Kaiser and the German government, okay, screw it. You know, this is our plan. We're going to go ahead and attack France. And that's what they did. In order to get to France, they've got to go through Belgium, a country whose neutrality had been guaranteed by Britain. And so in going through Belgium, they now get attacked by the British. The British declare war on Germany, and then the British, of course, are going to bring in the entirety of their worldwide empire with them as well. So this is going to divide the war up very quickly into two sides, into two kind of camps. Right? The allies, the main allies initially, are going to be Russia, Britain, and France. You have some other ones in there as well. No offense if you're from any of these, but these are the three main ones initially. Now, what's going to be interesting is Germany and Austria had been counting on Italy being on their side during the war. Italy decided to back out on Germany and actually joins the Allies because they figured they had more to gain attacking Austria-Hungary than attacking France. So the Allies, when you look at this on the balance sheet, they bring the extensive weight of their huge worldwide colonial empires. And this is going to include troops, economic impact, and of course, strategic locations around the world. The other side of this is going to be the Central Powers. All right, this is going to be basically Germany. Germany is going to be Team Germany, and then the other two. Right, the three of them are Germany, the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Right, the Ottomans are brought in because of an incident that takes place with a German battleship going through the Bosporus to bombard the Crimea, and so it's actually a pretty silly little story if you get a chance to look it up. It's pretty fun. These guys have much less imperial strength to draw upon, and of course, essentially they're going to be cut off of it because one of the things that Britain is going to do is maintain a very close blockade, or at least as close as possible, in World War I, of the North German ports, and of course in the Mediterranean, which means that this area is not going to be able to gain access to their colonial holdings, and essentially eventually these colonial powers are going to be snipped away as the war goes on. To do a little bit of the detail of kind of what happens and why things wind up the way that they are, because we're going to see one of the major nationalistic and psychological impacts coming from World War I is the way that the war plays itself out. It's not quick, and it's definitely not clean. All right? The 1914 campaign initially is going to expose one of the major shifts in warfare and is going to cause a significant problem to fighting the war, and that is that modern weapons had created an interesting shift in the way that you fight, in that for a period of time in the First World War, all of a sudden the defense has a major power advantage over the attacker. Normally, in warfare, both before and after, you wanted to be on the attack. You wanted to be attacking, right? While on the one hand, that means that you're kind of up and out and in an exposed position. Attacking gives you a certain moral impetus. It also means that you can pick kind of where and when and with what men and material you're going to be fighting the battle. You're going forward, you're attacking, right? But all of a sudden, now what we're going to see is, generally speaking, in World War I, you wanted to be tactically, you wanted to be on the defensive. You wanted them up and out in the open, and you wanted to be mowing them down with machine guns and rifle fire, artillery and grenades and things like that, okay? Now the Germans are going to advance into France as part of their Schlieffen plan, right? The idea is they're going to come in, they're going to swing through Belgium, and then they're going to come down on Paris from the north, but eventually they are stopped short of the ultimate goal of Paris. Paris not only represents the goal because of the fact that it's the political capital, but the roads and railroads all run through Paris, and it's the manufacturing hub for the French war effort. So it really is, it's not just the political capital, but it's also the number one strategic location in the war. So Paris's fall probably precipitates a German victory, just in case you were wondering, right? What that means is when the German war machine kind of stalls outside of Paris, they push the French, and then what's left of the British expeditionary force. Neither one of them have the power to kind of push the other one out of the way, because you got to go and you got to attack these guys in these positions. And so as a result of that, both sides are going to start looking for ways to go around. Typically what they're going to do is they're going to work their way on the map until they outflank each other, until eventually they find themselves anchoring on the North Sea in the north and the mountains of Switzerland in the south. And so by the end of 1914, neither side is going to be able to force a solution because they can't advance through these trenches with this rifle and machine gun fire, right? Now, in the east, the Russians do manage to rout the two Russian armies at the Battle of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes and begin driving them backwards. And essentially, in the east, what happens is you have kind of a reverse of what was supposed to happen. They were supposed to just sort of hammer the French, knock them out very quickly, and then send their forces to the east. Instead, what's going to happen is the Germans are going to do a pretty good job of hammering the Russians and eventually forcing them out of the war by late 1917, and then being able to concentrate all their forces in the west. So it's kind of an inverted scenario of what we're going to be seeing taking place. All right? What that means, though, is especially here on the Western Front and also on the Italian front in the Mediterranean, is a situation that's often referred to as trench warfare. You'll also find it in the east, but it's not going to be quite as locked down because of the wide open spaces. Right? So you've got these bloody attacks, these counterattacks that go back and forth because neither side can cross this space between the trenches that is often referred to as no man's land. They can't break the trenches and keep going. One of the things that you'll see when we detail out some of these battles is they're able to take the trenches. You're able to go over, if you get enough guys and you kind of push across the field, you can take these trenches and trench systems directly across, but you can't keep going beyond that. You can't advance into the open territory beyond because the enemy is rushing reinforcements by truck and by rail to the area, and of course all the guys that are attacking are on foot, and you've got to try to bring your entire army now with you, guys that have artillery, and guys that have medical, guys that have ammunition and supplies and things like that. And so you're just going to be caught in many of the cases these salients, these little blister-shaped formations where you get counterattacked by the enemy. And so what happens is you attack and you take the trench and then they push you out and they take your trench and you push them out and you fight back and forth through these trenches. And what that means is you're just piling up the dead back and forth in many of these sectors. In some cases, if you advanced something like anywhere between 2 and 6 miles a year towards your objective, that was considered progress. Millions of dead, but you get a little bit closer to the enemy's territory. What happens is soldiers lose hope in a military solution. Okay? The soldiers themselves, they live in filth, mud, and constant fear of bombardment. It was not uncommon for you to be sort of on duty in the trenches and then artillery rounds just harassing fire. Just kind of comes down and blows away the guy sitting next to you. So this is a real palpable kind of psychological shock for a lot of these people of what they thought war was going to be like, or what it's supposed to be like, at least in their minds. And so there's no way around, there's no real viable way over or under. And so the dead go unburied, attracting cat-sized rats, the blue bottle fly, and other pests. Soldiers are sometimes forced to live in these underground bunkers for days that become very unsanitary due to the lack of plumbing. And so here you can see this evolution. It's a couple of series of shots. This is a BEF trench in the early part of the war with these British guys. It's barely kind of chest deep. It comes to an end. It's in a small sort of open location. And eventually you fast forward to the French. Here in 1916, one of their trenches where it's deep, it's got baseboards and sandbags and barbed wire strung up over the top, and so it's a much more extensive kind of thing. And you can see the bodies are everywhere. The trenches fill up with mud, especially in Flanders. Aerial photography here on the top shows you how a lot of the artillery shells that land around the trenches give it an appearance not unlike the surface of the moon. This is a small wooded area that had been caught between the trenches that had turned into essentially matchsticks. Stuck in the ground where you've got dead bodies and exploded military equipment, burnt out trees, towns and villages that were caught between the lines were a lot of times flattened and destroyed. When we talk about nationalism, the effect that World War I has on that, all right, we can see that it's an evolutionary process, and in many cases, sort of a rude baptism. All right, initially when people are joining up with the war effort, right, the young men are initially very excited about joining this. This is part and parcel with the civilian population. The prospect of a war is cheered, not unlike when you go to sort of a football game pep rally, where yeah, we're going to get them, and they're singing songs. These guys will be singing these patriotic songs. In many cases, entire high school classes, they'd all go down and they'd volunteer in these huge throngs. All right? But what happens is that trench warfare and really the hardships of modern industrialized war really produces a rather sharp shock in terms of the popular mindset about war. By 1918, by a lot of people who had been in this for any period of time, war is seen as really horrible and kind of pointless as a result of that. Here's a scene of the crowds outside Buckingham Palace on the announcement of the Declaration of World War I. These guys are excited. They're all pumped up. These are the streets of Paris doing the same thing. All the people are on the streets and they're, yeah, and they're all getting ready. And so this is not what you would normally think that, even if you're the kind of person that thinks that war is an acceptable policy, most people aren't happy. They're not going to go out and be like, yeah, we're at war. I mean, even if you're sort of a pro-war kind of person, you say, well, war is a necessity. We'll get through it. That mindset, much more modern mindset, isn't directly related to this experience where, a lot of people cheered the war. Hooray, we're happy that there's going to be a war. We're going to show those guys who's boss. And then, war's terrible. This was not any good. Good example of this is the Battle of the Somme. We don't get a chance to detail all of these major battles in World War I. But this is a good example. This is a pretty typical battle of trench warfare. What the Battle of the Somme is actually a Franco-British combined assault on a series of German trenches near, you probably guessed it, the Somme River. All right. One of the problems that, of course, you've got to deal with is the fact these Germans are all entrenched in this area with machine guns and rifles and stuff like that. So one of the ways that the antagonists in World War I would try to get over this problem is massive artillery bombardment. Right? We're going to bomb the snot out of these guys, blow them away, and then we'll be able to cross over no man's land because all these guys will be dead and machine guns will be blown up and stuff like that. Well, of course, you can't hit exactly with artillery. It takes a little bit to be able to do this. And so the thinking was, well, the more that you bombard an area, the more damage you'll do. And that led to this massive Allied artillery bombardment that would last for 7 days. Okay? But all really it did was it caused them casualties initially when they first started coming down, but the Germans just hid in these underground cellars that they had built under the trenches for just such a purpose. Now, I'm sure it was not the most comfortable to have to spend an entire week underground with a whole bunch of other German dudes, but for the most part, these guys survived. What that means is as soon as the artillery bombardment lifts, and of course you can hear it when the bombs stop going off, these Germans, they rush up and they retake their positions on the front lines. And that means that the British assault wave that comes across is going to take some pretty massive casualties in no man's land. They do manage to overwhelm the German defenses of the Somme, and they push on beyond the German trenches behind them. But the problem with this is, just like you'll see again and again, when you break the trenches, is how you keep going. There's no way to really keep going. All these guys that are attacking are on foot, right? The Allied forces are going to tire out and actually are going to outrun their artillery support, which means that no longer can the big shells come in and help them. The Germans then are going to counterattack, and they're actually going to surround these guys on 3 sides, and they begin driving the Allies back to, for the most part, where they had started from. So this is a several-month-long battle that takes place. And in terms of real estate, not much changes hands. Okay? The results of this are the British are going to lose 420,000. All right? The French, who are much less engaged in the fight, are going to lose 20,000. Now the Germans are going to lose 500,000 guys. Now all of this, the net result is an Allied gain of 6 miles of territory. And that's going to be it. Okay? So when you look at kind of how this works itself out, you can't say, well, the Allies broke, yeah, they took some pretty tremendous losses, but they broke through. No, they didn't really break through. They got a little bit closer to Berlin, but that was it, right? So when you look at this, you say, well, how would you determine, if you're one of these guys, how would you determine who won or lost? Well, one of the ways is just, well, the Allies lost 440,000 guys, and the Germans lost 500,000 guys, so, it's like a 60,000 guy, victory. Because we inflicted more casualties on them than they did on us. There's a certain amount of truth to that, and that will work. You can, if you kill them and they kill you, and you kill them and they kill you, and then if they run out of guys first, then you can win. That's one way that you can win. but it's also a pretty ghastly, ghoulish, inhuman way to win a war, right? The enemy doesn't surrender, you don't outmaneuver them, you don't capture their stuff and they're forced to admit defeat, you just kill all of them until they can't send any more guys to the front. It's really good, and you pay for that on an almost direct exchange in blood yourself, right? A response to this can be seen here in the French Mutiny of 1917. One of the things, despite the fact that they had taken relatively light casualties in the Battle of the Somme, the French had taken horrendous casualties fighting around the city of Verdun in previous years, 1915, 1916. And as a result of that, okay, along with a number of other offensives that they had engaged in, the French generally had a pretty straightforward approach. So we're here, the Germans are over there, we're going to go get them. Oh, we got machine gun down. Well, what's going to happen is a guy named Nivelle is going to become the new French general, and his method of a rolling barrage, he's going to, well, this is the formula, we figured out how to beat the Germans, and we're going to beat them, okay? And so, of course, one of the things they didn't count on was the fact that the Germans had seen the rolling barrage at Verdun too, and they were going to figure out a way to counteract it, right? Well, what's going to happen here is a series of offensives around the Aisne River is going to prove that Nivelle actually didn't know what he was talking about. And what's going to happen is this group of French soldiers are ordered to go forward and fight some more, and they refuse to go. They start bleeding like sheep and making fun of the officers and stuff like that. Probably pretty funny if it wasn't so dire, right? What's going to happen, what's interesting here, is that the mutiny of this relatively small group of guys here in the French army is going to spread to all of France's army within a pretty short order. Now, this is a crisis point for the French, all right? A lot of these guys, a lot of these French soldiers, they're at the front and they just refuse to have themselves butchered in seemingly senseless fashion. And discipline begins to break down. A lot of these guys begin to just say, screw it. I'm going to go home. There's no point to this, okay? Now, what's good for the Allied war effort and bad for the Germans is that the Germans never figured this out, okay? Because the French, they managed to get in there pretty quickly. They bring in an old general, Pétain, who comes back in and he basically starts talking to a lot of these guys. He does this little tour around the French army in his staff car, and he says, look, okay, we understand what the deal is. You guys are upset. But he appeals to their nationalism, and he says, listen, the Germans are over there, and if you guys just go home, the Germans are going to walk in and they're going to take France. Is that what you really want? Oh, no, we don't really want that. And so he basically appeals to their sense of nationalism and says, okay, we won't ask you to charge machine guns anymore, but you do need to go back to the trenches and at least defend France. You need to at least do that. And so they managed to kind of stabilize the front, but they realized that it's not going to take the Germans long to figure out, hey, the French have stopped attacking us. And so, what's the deal with that? What that means is now that France is forced to turn to Britain and say, okay, you guys are going to have to start hammering the Germans. Well, why? Because they're going to have to be so focused on you that they can't pay us a lot of attention, okay? Because there's a good chance that another major victory by the Germans is going to snap the French soldiers' will to resist, and they're just going to give up and they're going to go home, all right? So the British and their empire begin bearing the brunt of these offensives on the Western Front, and attacking the Germans really from 1917 onward, but that also means that they're going to weaken themselves because ever increasingly the British are going to be forced to rely on their colonial troops to go forward and attack, and they're going to have the same level of enthusiasm being gunned down by machine guns that the French are going to have, and many of them from India and from South Africa and from Canada and New Zealand and Australia and a lot of these other places, due to they're fighting under the British Empire, they're going to we really don't want to be a part of this kind of thing anymore. Now, in terms of power in the world, if not the biggest, one of the biggest power nations around had sat this war out pretty effectively for the first few years, and that's the United States. One of the problems, though, of dealing with World War I had been, how is this war going to be prosecuted at sea? The idea of a blockade, a close blockade of coasts, the way that it had been done in the 1800s isn't really going to be possible anymore due to long-range coastal artillery. You've got to back up, and how do you stop goods from getting in and out? And then also, if you're the German Navy, how do you send out raiding vessels to attack enemy merchant fleets? And so the submarine isn't a very great system compared to its 1800s counterpart because you can't ask vessels to surrender, and you can't take prisoners. You just blow these ships up, and you leave them sinking in the water, and people are splashing around, and they're going to become shark food. And so this creates a number of problems that people are trying to deal with, the new realities of new modern warfare. Well, these German U-boats, the Unterseeboot, right, the submarine, right, they begun sinking a lot of these ships bound for England. Now, some of these ships also had American citizens on board. This is going to cause a great deal of problems, for the United States. We don't like seeing our citizens get blown away. Despite the fact that, of course, the Germans would put these big notices up in American port cities. Hey, if you get on a ship that's going to England or France, we're going to blow you up. You shouldn't do that kind of thing. Now, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson is going to warn Kaiser Wilhelm, he's going to tell him to back off, all right, citing one of the important American tenets here, the idea of neutrality of the seas. The oceans should not be war zones. You should leave us and our stuff alone. And, of course, the Germans know if you're going to go and trade with our enemies and not with us. And so, anyway, it's a rather complicated diplomatic affair. What's going to bring this to the head is a German U-boat is going to sink the British ship Lusitania with several Americans on board. There's going to be some threats back and forth. There are going to be a few more sinkings with that. It looks like the United States is going to declare war. Germany decides to back down here. They don't want a war, at least not yet, with the United States. And basically they paid the United States off with some cash as a result of that. But we're going to see a lot of tensions are going to rise as a result of that. One of the things that's going to take place here is 1916 is going to come and go. And 1916, in a lot of ways, is kind of the focal point of the war, in that ever increasingly, the Germans come to the realization that they're probably not going to be able to force a decision on land. At least it doesn't look like they're going to be able to do that. And so they're going to have to find some other way to defeat their opponents. One of the problems they've got, of course, is England. England is unassailable to them because it's an island. They can't just march an army into England the way that they have marched an army into both France and Russia. And so the Germans are looking forward to the idea that, well, if we really take our U-boats and really encircle Britain and just sink everything that's coming towards it, can we starve them out? Theoretically, yes. The technology in World War I doesn't quite exist yet. They get almost to that point in World War II, but not quite. Okay. The problem with this, of course, is they realize that if we do that, the Americans are going to declare war on us. They're going to put up with us sinking. It's one thing to sink British and French ships headed for England. It's another thing to sink American ships that are headed towards England. And so Germany begins preparing for the worst and says, well, if we do have to go to war with America, it'd be great if somebody would come in and kind of fix America's attention elsewhere. And so, to that end, the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, is going to write a letter to Mexico. At this point, it looked like the United States and Mexico might go to war over Veracruz incident. It's sort of complicated. And so, hey, you guys had almost gone to war with the United States, Mexico. How about you guys go ahead and do that? If you do that, if you come into the war on Germany's side, and once we win the war, we'll be able to enforce, everything that we want here at the peace treaty. And in return, when we win the war and you'll be our allies, we'll make sure that you guys get Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico from the United States. So that'll be, a plus from you, right? The Mexicans, to their credit, were, no, we don't want to go to war with the United States. That's an insane idea, right? Now, the reason this becomes important, though, is that the British are going to intercept this message and they're going to decode it, and they are going to then publish it, right? When this gets printed in the newspapers and this gets spread to the American public, this is really going to incense a lot of American citizens to want a war with Germany, because it looks like they're trying to conspire against them to have somebody attack them, because that's actually what was happening with this. A lot of Americans had really been pretty neutral. They may have been sort of more pro-British than pro-German, but for the most part they really did cherish their neutrality, and ever increasingly here in 1917 they're beginning this drift towards, we really don't like Germany, we really don't like what they're doing. And then finally the straw that's going to break the camel's back here, 1916, 1917, is Germany is going to declare unrestricted submarine warfare. And any vessel that's headed towards British waters, even if it's American, is going to be sunk on sight. Wilson decides, okay, this is too much, and he's going to ask the American Congress to declare war, which they would do so. And America is going to enter the war here in April of 1917, and it's going to bring its massive industrial capacity and, of course, worldwide empire with it, right? Now, the American army, though, is woefully unprepared. This was one of the calculations that Germany had made. A lot, if you're sitting there thinking, man, does Germany really need another enemy? Was this really smart to do? One of the things that they understood, though, was the fact that the United States didn't have an army. It essentially, it had guys in uniform, but it didn't have a modern army. It didn't have a large army. There was no reason for the United States to have a big army in 1916. What are they going to do? Go beat up the Canadians? You know, they'd rounded up the last of the Indians in the late 1800s, so that there's no major threat to the United States that would warrant a giant expense of having 1 million men under arms with machine guns and trucks and aircraft and all this kind of stuff. You don't need to spend that kind of money, right? So when the German political, the diplomatic people were getting with the military planners, they were saying, okay, how long is it going to take for the United States to get one, right? Because, I mean, obviously, it doesn't mean you can't have an army just because you don't start with one. And they said, well, it's probably taking about 12 months. It's probably taking about a year to get ready. And it turns out that that prediction was about right. It's not going to be until the middle part of 1918 that big American forces are finally going to start showing up in huge numbers. The other side of this war, the Eastern Front of this war, is going to see the Germans basically, with a couple of exceptions, pretty much on the offensive, right? Russia is going to blunder into a couple of major traps set by General von Hindenburg, right? And they're never going to really totally recover their balance as a result of the Battle of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes, okay? Now, the problem with this, in terms of comparing the Eastern Front to the Western Front, is the fact that Russia is a much more open landmass. And trench warfare kind of happens whenever the armies would stop maneuvering. They would kind of hunker down and they build these trench systems. But it's not totally possible in the same way that it goes from like ocean to ocean or ocean to mountains or anything like that. And there's no way to get around because the terrain is so broad and vast that the number of men fighting, they're never able to really complete these very long, impassable trench systems. So you can go around them if you need to, if you have the manpower to sort of fix a position and then kind of maneuver past it. All right. What that means is the Germans are also going to treat the Eastern Front as kind of a laboratory for, okay, well, the Russians have built a little trench system here. Let's try attacking it and see how that goes. And that's exactly what's going to happen is not only are they very successful militarily in driving the Russians backwards, but they're also very successful in gaining a lot of valuable experience they would try first in Italy and then eventually on the Western Front proper in the spring of 1918. Now, politically, what you're going to see is as the Russian armies are being driven backward, the Tsar's government is getting weaker and weaker. The Russian government is beginning to fall apart. It had only maintained its control over the population through the threat of military force, and as it looks like the Russian military is kind of falling apart, what you're going to see is a lot of Russians begin seeking different political leadership. Into this is going to come Vladimir Lenin. Lenin is a Marxist. He is a Marxist socialist. He's a believer in revolutionary redistribution of the wealth, all that kind of stuff. And he had been expelled from Russia for leading these types of rabble-rousing, as the Russians would probably call it. He was a political exile as a result of that. The Germans get a hold of Lenin and they smuggle him back into Russia during this chaotic period here in 1917. And Lenin now is going to start contacting the people, and not only does he have a beef against the Tsar's government in general, but he can add to it, look at this great failure of this war that the Tsar's government is fighting. And so the Tsar actually is first toppled and replaced by a brief sort of quasi-liberal government, which makes the fatal step to decide to continue fighting the war. So what that means is Lenin now is able to preach this communist message that not only can he say, well, we're going to have this perfect socialist, utopian, communist state, but also we're going to get out of the war. And unto him, the message was that communism is that workers are all equal, everybody's paid the same, they all have access to the same capital of the state, the government's going to own all the property and is going to dole this out with a great deal of equality. Well, the Bolsheviks are going to stage this revolution, and they're going to take over the government by violence, but they are going to be true to their promise to get the Russians out of the war. They're going to, okay, we're going to have to cough up a great deal of territory to the Germans, but whatever, we're going to get out of the war, and then that's going to be it. And what that means is by November of 1917, the Germans now have finished this war in the East, and they can now start transporting huge numbers of troops to the Western Front. But also headed towards the Western Front is the United States. When we consider not only the manpower and the industry and all that kind of stuff, there's also an interesting bit of ideology that begins infusing itself into the war effort thanks to the inclusion of the United States. And one of these is the 14 points that's going to be put forward by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. Initially, this starts off as policy proposals for what was going to be a peace conference. that then basically evolves into what is the raison d'etre for America's involvement in World War I. That this is what we're fighting for, right? In kind of summation, right? One, you want to see an end to secret treaties and secret alliances. We should have open covenants of peace, right? There should be a number of national homelands. These people, if they're going to fight for their, national independence, you should give them their national homelands. There should be a Poland, there should be a Hungary, that kind of thing. A very American position. There should be neutrality of the seas. That the seas should be free. You should get rid of militarism. You don't have to have these massive militaries that are threatening to blow each other up, right? And then a League of Nations, right, to ensure that these countries can get together and discuss their issues, right, before they have to resort to these types of war, right? When these national groups, many of which are subsumed into these multinational empires, right, they look at what the United States is proposing in the 14 points and they see salvation, right? The United States is fighting for the idea of national homelands, and some of them are going to turn against their government. We're also going to see that this is going to get exported around the world, that many of these colonized peoples, these guys in Africa that are fighting other Africans at the behest of some European, are going to question, why are we fighting for the Allies? Why are we fighting for these different imperial groups for these people? A lot of the people from India that are fighting in the British Empire, why are we being slaughtered in the trenches? A lot of these guys from Africa that are fighting for the French. How does this make sense? And so you'll have guys like the Czech Legion who will escape fighting for the Austro-Hungarians, and they'll actually go across Russia and work their way across the Pacific Ocean on boats, and then they'll go across America, across the Atlantic, and they'll actually wind up on the Western Front fighting against the Habsburgs just before the war ends. As I mentioned, World War I is a technology war. It is the first of the real technology wars. All wars involve some form of technology. But this is the first one where technology is part of the evolving technology is part of the evolution of the war. Probably the most important of these is the introduction of the machine gun, right? And so for those of you that don't know what a machine gun is, right, it's a rapid-fire heavy rifle, right? And you hold down the trigger, and you can fire as many bullets as the magazine will hold, or until the barrel begins to melt down from the heat. But these early models are really heavy, and they take several people just to move around. So what that means is it gives a great deal of firepower to just a few people, but you're not going to be able to relocate it very easily, at least not very early on in the war. So this is what's going to give initially a great deal of power to the defense over the offense. So when you have these areas that get broken, these trench areas that get broken, say, okay, well, it's time to send in the cavalry, and these guys in huge formations, these guys on horses, they start riding through. Well, you get 2 or 3 machine guns held by just 20, 30 guys, right? And they can hold off a whole cavalry brigade at a great deal of distance, just because you got this rapid rate of fire, you get this huge target, a guy on a horse, and so the breakthrough just can't happen. Okay, you get these guys, even if they're on foot, they're kind of working their way towards these machine gunners. It's going to slow everything down. Okay, so cavalry is going to be banished from the battlefield, and you're going to have no exploitation of breakthroughs as a result of that. We're also going to see that this is one of the early uses in the modern period of chemical warfare, right? And that is going to be the use of poison gas. Initially, you would get this to the enemy by releasing it from canisters, and then later they would put this into artillery shells and fire it into the enemy trenches. And the idea was you're either going to kill or incapacitate them. You have 2 sort of main types of gas, not the only ones, there were a lot of other ones, but the 2 main ones that they want to use. Chlorine gas is designed to kill you, it gets in your lungs and it causes your lungs to break down. And the other one is mustard gas. Mustard gas can kill you, but it's for the most part designed to incapacitate you. Your mucous membrane detaches, your eyes cloud over, that kind of stuff. And so basically the effect of this is eventually both sides kind of adapt to this, and that is they start wearing gas masks during these attacks. So just when you thought that the war couldn't get any worse, it starts to looking like these guys are on the surface of the moon because they got these gas masks on. So here you can see these guys wearing these gas masks. These guys that have been mustard gassed. So it gets worse and worse. One of the interesting exceptions to the rule that technology kind of dehumanized the war is the introduction of the airplane for the first time in military history. Now, initially, the airplane is just used for scouting. You fly an airplane over the enemy line, you take a guy who's either got a camera or a sketch pad or something like that, and say, okay, this is what I think, flies back down, and he tells the generals, what he saw, But eventually these guys realized that, hey, maybe we should stop the enemy from sending a plane over to circle on top of us. And so the airplanes start fighting each other to maintain dominance of the air, right? So while technology tended to dehumanize the war on the ground, these planes created the sort of chivalrous knights of the sky kind of phenomenon on both sides. And what you see is it was not uncommon for these guys to send word through the lines, you know, these two aces are going to meet over the battlefield at a certain time, one's going to try to shoot the other one down, and they wore these dashing clothes, they had these scarves and goggles and, you know, the boots and stuff like that. And so they were very much, you know, the idea of one-on-one, you know, kind of warfare that had really been absent. And of course, the cool thing about this was you could watch all this from the trenches. All you do is look up and you watch these planes go at it with each other, okay? By the end of the war, though, you do see some technological changes. At the beginning of the war, you know, you see some of these planes, they look like basically kites with like lawnmower engines flying through the sky, and how they just don't crash to the ground of their own stupidity seems sort of silly. But by the end of the war, you're actually seeing some pretty interesting strides in terms of airplane technology. Germany could bomb London using Zeppelins and things like that. The Allies could also hit targets deep within Germany using long-range bombers as well. This is Manfred von Richthofen, right? Most of you would probably recognize his pseudonym, right? The Red Baron, right? This is Eddie Rickenbacker, who was a race car driver before World War I and was the #1 American ace aircraft pilot in the First World War. Well, the thing that eventually begins to break down the deadlock status of fighting in the trenches is the introduction of the tank. The British are the ones that are going to develop this, but they are going to borrow American tractor technology, the Caterpillar tread from an American tractor company. And what you basically do is you get this vehicle that can cross this no man's land. It can cross trench lines using the propulsion system, but it's heavily armored, so it can repel enemy fire, and it also has some very heavy weapons, cannons and machine guns, all of its own. Soldiers in its train, right, trailing along behind it, can now cross no man's land with a great deal of effectiveness, because they can take cover behind the tank, or they can wait for the tank, kind of silences the enemy guns, and then they can move up. And so infantry and tanks working in tandem with each other are a very powerful, kind of potent weapon. This was something that the Allies had, and that the Germans never really fully got a handle on. The Germans had no industry to be able to produce these tanks on their own, other than a handful of German-made tanks. And some of them are pretty ridiculous, so they look like giant sort of railroad engines. And for the most part, the German tanks that they used were captured Allied ones, right? And of course, as a result of that, the tank really kind of catches the Germans off guard, and they have no tank defenses. Not a lot of anti-tank weapons that they have at their disposal. Many of the anti-tank guns they have are just artillery pieces they kind of point down and try to hit tanks with, and so it's not a very good system as a result of that. Well, when we look at World War I on a worldwide kind of basis, we're going to see that the war does not confine itself to Europe. It explodes throughout the colonies of Africa, India, Middle East, Pacific Islands, and every ocean around the world. One of the biggest battles that takes place is off the coast of South America, right? Well, local colonial populations are enlisted, but they're led by European officers to fight their own neighbors, who of course also are enlisted and led by enemy European officers. What this does is this fans the flames of local nationalist sympathies, because why are we dying for a war that started someplace else? You can see a little bit of the propaganda of this. Oh, you're going to fight alongside the French, and you're going to be treated as an equal. And okay, these guys are going to they're colonials, and they're under the thumb of European colonial rule. And the idea that you're going to go and fight and die at the behest of other people begins to rankle a lot of these folks along the wrong way. You'll see dreadnoughts on the high seas, fighting each other. You'll also see guys like T.E. Lawrence are going to be able to get into the Arabic world and use this nationalism to stir up rebellions against the non-Arabic central government of the Ottoman Empire, because they were Turkish. And so this is something that, as it exports itself around the world, is going to be a very potent sort of nationalistic force, and an anti-imperial one as well. As I mentioned, right, the U.S. initially doesn't have much of an army, and it's definitely not anything that's going to strike fear into the heart of most industrialized nations. But its Navy does make, it is a modern one, and it does make an immediate impact in helping to break the U-boat blockade, right? We're also going to see that America is going to be able to respond with its industry, because while they hadn't been involved in World War I, they had been making a lot of stuff to sell to especially the Allies in World War I. And so this massive American industrial output is now going to be converted over to use for the war. As I mentioned, though, the Army's going to have to kind of wait. You can't just snap your fingers and get 1 million men under arms and trained and with weapons and know what they're doing and working together as a team. It's not until the spring of 1918 and really kind of the summer of 1918 that the United States is really making this huge presence on the battlefield, right? But the United States does make an important impact in terms of morale. It's easy to overlook this. As historians, and as students of history, you want to look back and say, well, how many men did the United States have? How many tanks did they produce? How many bombs did they drop on the enemy? That kind of thing. It's easy to quantify that, whereas morale, you can't quantify. You can't put a number on it. But morale is a very potent factor, okay? As we saw, the French almost quit because of bad morale. And had they quit, it wouldn't have mattered how many men that they had, because the number of men at the front would have been 0. So when the Americans show up, the morale effect they have is these guys, the American soldiers, haven't been fighting since 1914. They haven't been punished in the trenches year after year for no apparent gain. They're fresh. And moreover, they got kind of a chip on their shoulders. They've been told by all these other European powers that, you Americans, you're a bunch of country bumpkin rubes, you're useless. You guys don't know how to, engage in sort of modern warfare. You guys are idiots. And so Americans kind of have a point to prove. And so they get out of the way, French guy, get out of the way, British guy. They're singing these songs, about how they're going to go over there and they're going to kick some butt. And so this has an electrifying effect on the Allies. Allied morale all around these guys begins to rise. They don't want to get shown up by these American guys. These guys are country bumpkins, right? And so they really lift the spirit of the Allies and helps these guys out. Now, like I said, it's not possible to really put a number on this, but it is real and it is important. This is the fighting that takes place outside of Paris. That was Chateau Thierry, right? This is where they eventually will stop the major German offensive from capturing Paris. And of course, it was by these African-American soldiers of the United States Army who are going to kind of save the day for the Parisians. Interesting little history tidbit for those of you who are interested in this, all right? But what we're going to see now is, as I mentioned, a race to the Western Front. The question is, who's going to arrive first? Is it going to be Germany's reinforcements from the east, or is it going to be the Americans coming into the war really for the first time from the west? And we're going to see that actually the Germans are going to win the race, at least initially. All right? And they are going to launch one final desperate series of offensives in the west, nicknamed or codenamed Operation Michael. And as I mentioned, in previous years, especially for the Allies, if you advanced 6 miles in a year, right, that was considered a pretty good year. Yeah, we're that much closer to the Germans, right? Instead of that, 6 miles a year, what we're going to see is the Germans are going to be using these new infiltration tactics, these new what they refer to as stormtrooper kind of tactics, and they're going to break the Allied line in 5 places, and they're advanced for over 20 miles in some cases in just a few days. Okay, and they're going to come very, very close to Paris and winning the war. But of course, we're going to see that the same problems that have beset the Allies in breaking the trench lines are going to beset the Germans now, which is all these guys are on foot. They're going to eventually advance unsupported into enemy territory, and they're going to get surrounded, okay? The question is, though, are they going to get deep enough to where you can't offer any resistance? If they just keep going and if they capture Paris, it won't matter, that they're surrounded, because they'll have Paris, right? A few American troops that are on hand, they do help save the day. And then when the Germans finally do run out of steam, okay, the Allies begin counterattacking. And in capturing this kind of huge contingent of German forces, this is going to completely turn the war on its ear. And as they begin pushing the Germans backward, we're going to see that now German morale is going to break. Okay? And so by autumn, the German army is really on full-fledged retreat, and they're being pushed out of France. Now, a lot of this we would like to attribute to superior technology or superior uses, but we have to be honest that a lot of this is just simply a war of attrition. The Allies had more guys than the Germans did, and the Germans are going to run out of guys first. Okay? We're also going to see that nationalist revolutions begin erupting within places like the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire. In this case, the abdication of the Habsburg Emperor is going to cause it simply to cease to exist. All right? As I mentioned, the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, in Asia, is going to face a number of uprisings and a few military defeats there. They're going to lose control of Jerusalem for the first time since the Crusades, and they're going to quit the war as well. So Germany, very briefly, is going to face going on with this war alone, but you've got mutinous soldiers and sailors, and starving population at home that is really being heavily impacted, one, by the harshness of the blockade, the fact they can't bring in more goods for the civilian population, and two, the decision by the German government that they're going to send all the resources possible to the front, which is leading to a decrease, in some cases, a decrease in the diet of the average German citizen. Okay? When the German Navy is ordered to put to sea, a lot of these German sailors here at Kiel determined, well, this is a suicide charge against the British Navy. It turns out it wasn't, but they decided it was, and they mutiny. This mutiny spreads into Germany itself and causes a general rebellion all around the country. The German leadership realizes that they need the army to come home and quell this rebellion that's taking place inside the country. But of course, it's not like the Allies are going to give them a day pass. Oh, you guys got to go home? Okay, well, you guys go home for 2 weeks and then come back and start fighting again. They're going to have to ask the Allies for a ceasefire. And they're going to basically have to surrender. And that's exactly what happens. The Germans asked for a peace before really the troops had even been pushed completely out of France. The German army is still occupying huge areas of France. They've been pushed backwards, but they really haven't been defeated or destroyed. But they're forced to ask for an armistice, and that's exactly what's going to happen. The Kaiser is going to abdicate, and November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day, now known in America as Veterans Day, is when the guns are going to finally fall silent. Well, when World War I ends, we're going to see that there are a lot of people, because of the tens of millions of people that are going to die, they really have a vested interest in, hey, how about we avoid doing that again, if it's cool with everybody. Leaders of Europe and really the rest of the world are going to get together in Versailles, France, to try to discuss how to create such a peace that will last and not have another world war. You and I know that that's not going to work, because even if you don't know anything about history, you know I wouldn't be calling it World War I if there were only one of them. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, he's going to arrive to ensure what he referred to as a peace without victors. This is very popular with the people, the idea that we're not going to punish the Germans and make them want a war of revenge, the same as the French had wanted a war of revenge with the Germans after the Franco-Prussian War. The leaders, though, of Europe, they very much want a peace for the victors. Okay? Woodrow Wilson proposes a number of new nationalities and national determination within the Eastern European countries. The Big Four, and the other members of this big coalition, where you've got Wilson, the President of the United States, you've got Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, you've got the President of France, and you've got the President of Italy, okay? They have no problems with dismembering Germany and Austria-Hungary. Oh yeah, we'll take these guys apart, okay? When Wilson says we should use the same idea for colonies around the world, no, Woodrow, I don't think so, because for the most part, Britain and France were the major colonial powers around the world, and that would cause them to lose money and territory and things like that. So, in fact, what you're going to see is not only are Britain and France not going to lose colonies, they're actually going to gain colonies. Japan, due to its support for the war, support for the Allies, is going to gain power structures here in Asia, much to the chagrin of China. China had come into the war very early on when it looked like Germany might still win, and decided to support the Allies. And they thought that this would give us some muscle at the bargaining table, but instead, no. China got largely ignored, and Japan, because it's a rising industrial power in Asia, got some service that really China is going to be rather upset about. Right? When you look at the effect that Versailles has on the Central Powers, it's easy to kind of tick this off, right? As I mentioned, Austria-Hungary ceases to exist. The Habsburg Emperor had abdicated by this point, and the empire is broken up into many, many little nationalistic countries, all right? The problem with this, though, is most of these little nationalist countries, while you may have a majority of Hungary as Hungarians, you've got a lot of these other little nationalities in there as well. And so it doesn't make a nice, clean, neat, nationalistic map. The Germans are forced to pay a really heavy debt of reparations. We'll talk about that in more detail here in a second. The Ottoman Caliph hangs on for a little while, but he eventually abdicates as well. And you're going to see that the Ottoman Empire finally breaks up into its component parts based on semi-national, semi-colonial lines as well. And I love this little political cartoon from the German point of view of how they viewed the Versailles Treaty. You've got Wilson, and you got Lloyd George, and you got Clemenceau of France, and they're leading our German sort of Prussian officer representative of Germany to the gallows, or to the guillotine, and they're going to cut his head off, right? One of the things that you've got to understand prior to thinking about, well, this is what the Allies did to the Germans following World War I, was it was already impoverished from the naval blockade and the war. It had been bled white of its young men. The people literally were starving in some cases in Germany. They didn't know if they were going to survive the winter of 1918 1919. And then on top of that, okay, the Allies come in and say, okay, you owe us a lot of money, because you broke our stuff and killed our people, and so now you got to pay us back. This was actually not an atypical kind of thing. Dating back to several centuries before, when one side lost, they had to pay for the losses of the other side. But when wars were relatively small, and the number of men engaged were, in the tens of thousands rather than in the tens of millions, that was pretty easy to stomach that. Yeah, we blew up your fort, we'll have to pay for it. Okay, no problem. When we blew up your country and we killed 1% of your population, wait a second, okay? Especially since the fact that the Germans are already broke. Well, compounding this is the fact that we're going to cut off some of your revenue stream. Every colony that Germany had around the world is taken from it. So that's less money to pay back with. And then also even some of the home territory is going to be carved away from Germany and given over to the new state of Poland. They're also forced to sign part of the Versailles Treaty called the War Guilt Clause, which admitted, okay, yeah, we started the war, World War I is our fault. Which isn't totally true. Does Kaiser Wilhelm deserve a lot of the blame for starting World War I? Yeah. But to say that Germany started it all by itself, no, that's really not true. Even if it was true, this is going to incense the Germans. Basically say, okay, all this is our fault, and everybody's dumping on us. Right? They're also forced to decrease their army down to 100,000 men. This may sound like a lot. There's definitely be a lot to try to fit in this room, right? But for a country the size of Germany, with a population the size of Germany, 100,000 men is like a plussed-up police force. It's very small. It's not good for national defense. And of course, many of the pieces of military technology that we need to defend a nation are going to be disallowed. No heavy machine guns, right? No aircraft, no military aircraft, no submarines, no heavy artillery, none of that. No tanks, none of this kind of stuff. And so the idea was that, well, you don't want the Germans to attack anybody else, so you keep their army small. But of course, that's going to provoke an opposite reaction, which is they're not even going to allow us to defend ourselves from this. Right? One of the creations that is going to happen here is that Wilson is very skillfully going to tie creation of the League of Nations to all the other things that the Big Four, the other three members of the Big Four want. Oh, you want the money, you want the colonies, you want all this kind of stuff. Wilson doesn't feel really good about all of this, but okay, fine, you can have all that, but you got to have the League of Nations. Now, the way that it's supposed to work was it was designed to prevent another world war. That was its number one, kind of goal. These countries would openly discuss their grievances before wars began. You and I both know that that's going to fail. Okay. Nations would then act in concert to fight off these aggressive moves of other countries. If you do have somebody that breaks the peace and invades somebody else, then all the countries, okay, we're going to gang up on this guy and we're going to force him out. But nobody really wants to do that. The way that it actually worked was that the victorious nations, the powerful nations from World War I, are going to use their influence to kind of band together and gang up on either Germany or the Soviet Union or any of the other weaker powers whenever they felt like it. All right? So anybody who wasn't in the club of the cool countries often steered clear of open converse in the League because there was no point in engaging in it anyway. So this is going to weaken it and is never going to allow it to really fully take effect as a deliberative power body in the world. Now, when Woodrow Wilson returns home, he feels pretty good, okay? He says he got his peace without victors kind of plan. The problem with this for the United States government is presidents negotiate the treaties, but the Senate of the Congress has to ratify it. And when the Senate reads what all's in this, they have some major objections to especially the League of Nations. One of the fears that the U.S. Congress had was that the United States would be drawn into future wars by somebody else. You'd have the League of Nations would vote to send American troops elsewhere. And they said, no, it's our job as the Congress to declare war on other people. And when Wilson refuses to really work with these guys, okay, he basically says it's my way or the highway, a lot of these guys in the Senate say, fine, highway, okay, and they shoot down the whole treaty. And so what's going to happen here is the United States following World War I is in the prime position for world leadership. It is relatively undamaged by the war. The losses that it has sustained were nothing like what you'll see the rest of the world. Its industry had flowered because of World War I. It had trade contacts all over the world. It had, really in a lot of ways, the diplomatic high ground in the fact that we didn't really want anything from the rest of the world. No money, no land, none of that kind of stuff. And so it was in a prime position to really offer some leadership to the rest of the world. And instead, we're not going to participate in that kind of thing. And so what's interesting is, you'll see that this is a political cartoon that I really love. This is one that was done here as the League of Nations gets ratified. And it's Peace and Future Cannon Fodder is the title here. And you've got our guys here coming out from the negotiating hall at the Treaty of Versailles. You get this kid in a corner who's crying, and he's reading the harsh terms for the Treaty of Versailles. And the guy says, "Curious, I seem to hear a child weeping." And above his head it says a class of 1940. And basically this is the prediction that in 1940 there's going to be another war to deal with the harsh conditions that were created by the Versailles Treaty. And like I said, what was weird was this was done in 1920. And so it was eerily prophetic that the young people at the end of World War I are going to have to fight another war to pay for the mistakes made by the guys in closing out the First World War. And that turns out to be exactly what's going to take place. When you look at post-war Europe, kind of at a broad kind of stroke, following World War I, European economies are going to revive somewhat, all right? But that's mostly just because, I mean, they can't be as bad as they were during the war. And you're going to have some bumps in the road. Germany will go through a recession, and then, get some money, and then, have these problems, and France will have some good times and some bad times. Never will they have kind of the same success that takes place here in the United States. But there is going to be some economic shifts. You're also going to see, for example, a lot of social norms are pretty openly challenged. You'll see, for example, a number of gay bars will open up in Berlin, cabaret shows in France and some other places, sexually risque, kind of stuff. You'll see that a lot of social norms really do come under assault in the wake of World War I, whether you're talking about alcohol, drug use, stuff like that. So social stuff, right? Now, Germany is going to adopt a democratic government. It's called the Weimar Republic, right? Where the Kaiser is going to be gone. Initially, the government is going to be in the sleepy little German town, Weimar. It eventually would move back to Berlin because that's where the government kind of needs to be. But really, the Weimar Republic has the deck stacked against it. All right, you've got massive inflation, submission to foreign whims. I mean, at one point, France occupies the country or parts of the country because they can't pay their debts off. You have internal strife where you've got people fighting on the streets inside Germany. Communist gangs take over, whole towns in some cases, and then you got the Stahlhelm guys, the old veterans of World War I. They start fighting these guys. Literally pitched battles in some cases in the streets. Now, a lot of economic success, especially for Germany, is based on U.S. support. Essentially, the United States sort of loaning money to the Germans to keep these guys going. You're also going to see a lot of people are afraid of the same thing happening in their country that had happened inside of Russia, which was a Bolshevik takeover. You'll see the United States is extremely scared of this, and for the first time clamps down hard on immigration. The United States had a pretty open policy towards immigration prior to 1920, and then all of a sudden they're very afraid of a communist influx, and they start clamping down on this. Other European nations are very scared of this because they've got strong socialist elements. What if they look toward Russia, and what if they try to take over here? This is going to attempt to happen in a lot of these places. So you've got a great deal of tumult and unease following or immediately following World War I. And so when we look later at the interwar period, we're going to see that unease is going to play itself out really around the world in some rather unpredictable, but eventually it's all going to converge in kind of one point and how it plays itself out.